In 1727, a man in London was pulled from his bed in the middle of the night, arrested by officers acting on a tip from an informant, and later executed for something that today would not raise a single eyebrow. He was not a murderer. He was not a thief. His crime was who he loved. For 300 years, that same island nation, the one that once hanged people for their private relationships, would go on to legalize same-sex marriage, normalize contraception, and put frank conversations about sex, consent, and identity into classrooms and primetime television. How did a society built on shame, silence, and strict religious law transform into one of the most sexually open cultures in the Western world? And more importantly, what does that transformation tell us about where Britain is heading next? Stay with me, because the ending of this story might surprise you far more than the beginning does. Because somewhere between that execution and today's headlines lies one of the most dramatic reversals in the entire history of Western social attitudes, and almost none of it happened the way you might expect. This is the story of British sexuality, stretching from 1707, the year England, Scotland, and Wales were formally united into Great Britain, all the way to 2026. It is a story about laws that criminalized love, wars that pulled women into public life, medical breakthroughs that rewrote the rules of family planning, and generations of ordinary people who quietly, and sometimes very loudly, refused to accept the limits placed on their private lives. This history matters today because so much of the modern conversation around consent, gender, identity, and relationships did not appear out of nowhere. It was built, argument by argument, protest by protest, court case by court case, over the course of 3 centuries. Over the next 20 minutes, we will travel from the rigid moral codes of the 18th century through the hidden underground cultures of the Victorian era, into the explosive sexual revolution of the 1960s, and finally into the app-driven, algorithm-shaped world of today. Along the way, we will meet reformers, rebels, monarchs, campaigners, and ordinary citizens whose private choices repeatedly became public battlegrounds, reshaping the laws and attitudes that still influence Britain right now. Think of this less as a single straight line of progress and more as a long, uneven tug of war. One where every gain was contested, every freedom was fought for, and every generation believed, often wrongly, that they had finally reached the end of the argument. By the time we reach the final minutes of this video, you will understand exactly why a country once firmly defined by strict Victorian modesty now regularly tops international surveys measuring social liberalism and personal freedom. In the early 18th century, Britain was a deeply religious society, and the Church of England held enormous influence over what counted as acceptable behavior. Sex outside of marriage was treated as a serious moral failing, and the legal system backed up that judgment with real punishment. Adultery, fornication, and sexual relations between men were all treated as offenses against both God and the state. The Buggery Act, first passed under Henry VIII in 1533 and still fully enforced throughout the 1700s, made sexual acts between men a capital crime, and men genuinely were executed under this law well into the 19th century, often on the testimony of paid informants who infiltrated private gatherings. Meanwhile, women's sexuality was almost entirely defined through the lens of marriage and reproduction. A woman's social value was closely tied to her chastity before marriage and her fidelity within it, and an illegitimate pregnancy could mean social ruin, crushing poverty, or being permanently cast out of a family. Yet beneath this strict public morality, a very different private world quietly thrived. London in particular had a large, semi-hidden culture of brothels, referred to at the time as bawdy houses, alongside so-called molly houses, secret meeting places where gay men could socialize, dance, and form relationships away from the constant threat of the law. Wealth mattered enormously here. Aristocrats often lived by a noticeably looser, quieter set of unwritten rules than the poor, who faced the harshest legal consequences whenever they were caught. Daily life for the average person revolved around the church calendar, arranged or economically motivated marriages, and a rigid class structure that dictated who could realistically court whom and under what circumstances. Sexuality itself was rarely discussed openly in polite company. Instead, it was managed, regulated, whispered about, and hidden, present everywhere in practice, yet spoken of almost nowhere in public. Marriage itself was often less about romantic love and more about property, inheritance, and social standing, particularly among the landed classes, where a favorable match could secure a family's fortune and social standing for generations of descendants to come. Divorce, meanwhile, was almost impossible to obtain and typically required a private act of Parliament, meaning that even deeply unhappy marriages usually lasted an entire lifetime. For the rural poor, courtship customs varied widely by region, and some communities quietly tolerated premarital intimacy so long as it eventually led to marriage, while others enforced far stricter expectations under the constant threat of public shaming. Illegitimate children were common enough that many parishes maintained separate poor relief systems specifically for unmarried mothers, revealing the wide gap between official public morality and everyday lived reality. The Victorian era, beginning in 1837 with the coronation of Queen Victoria, is often remembered as the most sexually repressed period in British history, and in public life, that reputation was largely well earned. Victoria's reign brought an intense cultural emphasis on modesty, domesticity, and the widespread belief that a truly respectable woman had little to no interest in sex at all. And yet, this was simultaneously an era of dramatic contradiction. As the Industrial Revolution pulled millions of people from rural villages into crowded, anonymous cities, prostitution expanded enormously in scale, and moral reformers grew alarmed at what they saw as a public health and moral crisis. This alarm led directly to the Contagious Diseases Acts of the 1860s, which allowed police to forcibly detain and examine women merely suspected of sex work, a policy that sparked one of the first major feminist campaigns in British history. Activists like Josephine Butler argued forcefully that these laws punished women alone while completely ignoring the men who paid for their services, a double standard that would echo through debates for the next century. Then, in 1885, Parliament passed the Labouchere Amendment, a law that criminalized so-called gross indecency between men in famously vague terms broad enough to prosecute almost any form of intimacy between men, even in cases entirely without direct proof of any specific acts. This law would later be used to convict the playwright Oscar Wilde in one of the most sensational trials of the entire century, a trial that ended his career and his health, and sent a chilling warning across the country about the steep price of living outside accepted norms. Women's lives were shifting too, even if more quietly. The late Victorian period saw the emergence of the so-called New Woman, an educated, often unmarried figure who pursued careers, cycled through city streets, and questioned the assumption that marriage and motherhood were a woman's only legitimate purpose. Suffrage campaigners increasingly linked political rights to bodily autonomy, arguing that women could never be treated as full citizens, while their own marriages and their own bodies remained legally controlled by their husbands. At the very same time, religious authority was slowly losing its once total grip on personal life, as scientific research, expanding medical knowledge, and a growing, increasingly literate middle class began asking new and uncomfortable questions about the human body, desire, and where the line between morality and law truly belonged, quietly setting the stage for the slow unraveling of centuries-old assumptions. Popular culture during this period was equally contradictory. Music halls entertained working-class audiences with surprisingly bawdy songs and innuendo, while so-called respectable society publicly condemned any hint of impropriety. Pornographic literature and photography circulated far more widely than official Victorian morality would ever admit, often marketed discreetly to precisely the same middle-class gentlemen who publicly championed strict moral reform. Meanwhile, the medical profession began treating female sexuality itself as a subject worthy of clinical study, sometimes with genuinely progressive intent, and sometimes in deeply misguided ways, including the widespread diagnosis of so-called hysteria, a label frequently applied to women who simply expressed desire, frustration, or independence outside narrow social expectations. Newspapers of the era walked a similarly contradictory line, publishing outraged editorials about declining public morality on one page while running sensational, thinly veiled coverage of divorce cases and scandal trials on the very next, feeding exactly the appetite they claimed to condemn. The 20th century arrived with two devastating world wars that reshaped British attitudes towards sex in ways no single law ever could. During the First World War, women entered factories, offices, and public transport in unprecedented numbers, gaining new financial independence and new opportunities to meet people well outside their usual, tightly controlled social circles. The Second World War accelerated this shift even further as a truly global conflict brought hundreds of thousands of American and Allied soldiers into British towns, alongside constant wartime anxiety and a widespread sense that the old rules simply no longer applied in the same rigid way they once had. Rates of premarital relationships rose noticeably, and so did public concern about it, expressed loudly in newspapers, sermons, and government reports. But there was no putting that particular change back in the bottle once it had started. After both wars ended, rapid urbanization pulled young people further away from tightly knit village communities, where everyone knew everyone else's business, and into large, comparatively anonymous cities, where private life could genuinely stay private for the first time. Education expanded significantly through the mid-century, and with it came slightly more open, if still quite limited, information about the human body, reproduction, and relationships. Radio, and soon afterward television, began carrying conversations and storylines that would once have been entirely unthinkable in a public broadcast. Meanwhile, a real and growing generational divide was opening up across the country. Older Britons, who had lived their entire lives under the strict moral codes of the early century, increasingly found themselves at odds with their own children, who had grown up surrounded by mass media, expanding education, and a booming post-war economy that offered young people options their parents never had. This deepening tension between generations was slowly and quietly building steadily toward one of the most dramatic transformations in the country's entire social history. The interwar years also saw the rise of early marriage guidance clinics and the first tentative public discussions of birth control, championed by campaigners such as Marie Stopes, whose clinics and widely read books offered practical advice to married couples, despite fierce opposition from religious authorities. Cinema became an enormously influential force during this period as well, introducing romantic ideals, fashion, and behavior imported largely from Hollywood, subtly reshaping how young Britons imagined courtship and desire. Meanwhile, the gramophone and dance halls gave young working-class men and women new, semi-supervised spaces to socialize outside the direct watch of parents or clergy, spaces that would have been almost unthinkable just 2 generations earlier. The 1960s brought what historians now simply call the sexual revolution, and Britain sat firmly at the center of it. In 1961, the contraceptive pill became available in Britain, initially restricted to married women only, but its availability expanded rapidly throughout the decade, giving women unprecedented, reliable control over their own reproduction for the first time in recorded history. Then, in 1967, Parliament passed the Sexual Offences Act, which partially decriminalized homosexual acts between consenting adult men in private, a landmark and long overdue law that, while still limited, still unevenly enforced, and still excluding the armed forces and merchant navy, nonetheless marked the beginning of the end for centuries of outright criminalization. That very same year, the Abortion Act of 1967 legalized abortion in Great Britain under specific medical conditions, another seismic and deeply contested shift in how the state related to women's bodies and personal choices. Public opinion, especially among younger people, was shifting rapidly toward greater tolerance, fueled by new music, changing fashion, an energized feminist movement, and a much broader cultural rebellion against traditional authority figures of every kind. Economically, women's growing and increasingly permanent presence in the paid workforce, combined with genuinely reliable contraception, meant that early marriage and immediate childbearing were no longer treated as the only acceptable path through adult life. Culturally, magazines, films, and eventually television programs began exploring relationships, desire, and personal identity with a level of frankness that would have been entirely unimaginable back in the 1930s. This was not a single isolated event, but an avalanche of interconnected change, with one new law and one shift in public attitude repeatedly triggering the next, permanently altering what British society considered normal, acceptable, and legal within the space of a single remarkable decade. The decade also saw the rise of a genuinely youth-driven counterculture, centered in cities like London and Liverpool, where music, fashion, and art openly challenged the conservative values of the previous generation. Feminist organizing gathered fresh momentum too, with campaigns for equal pay, workplace rights, and reproductive autonomy increasingly framed as inseparable from the broader fight for sexual freedom. Meanwhile, the decriminalization of 1967 remained deeply incomplete in practice, since gay men could still be dismissed from jobs, denied housing, or subjected to harassment by police who continued enforcing other related laws well into the following decades. A reminder that legal change and lived equality rarely arrive at exactly the same moment, and that a law changing on paper is often only the very first step of a much longer social journey. Fast forward to the 21st century, and the pace of change has only continued to accelerate. In 2000, the age of consent was finally equalized regardless of sexual orientation, closing a legal gap that had persisted for decades despite years of campaigning. Civil partnerships arrived in 2004, offering same-sex couples legal recognition for the very first time, followed by full marriage equality for same-sex couples in England, and Wales in 2013, with Scotland following shortly after, changes that would have seemed almost unthinkable to a Victorian lawmaker just over a century earlier. Today, surveys consistently show that younger generations in Britain report far more fluid and flexible views on sexual orientation and gender identity than their grandparents ever did, and open conversations about mental health, consent, and relationship diversity have become genuinely mainstream in a way that simply did not exist even 50 years ago. Social media platforms and dating apps have completely rewired how people actually meet romantic partners, reshaping everything from first encounters to long-term relationship expectations, for better, and, in many well-documented cases, for worse. Sex education in schools, though still politically debated, now covers topics such as consent, healthy relationships, and online safety, subjects that were once considered far too explicit for any classroom setting. The Me Too movement, which gained massive traction across Britain from 2017 onward, forced a long overdue national reckoning with sexual harassment and the abuse of power, changing workplace policies, media coverage, and everyday public conversation almost overnight. Britain's cultural influence has also flowed in both directions simultaneously, absorbing global trends from social media and streaming platforms, while continuing to export its own legal and social models to other Commonwealth nations, still actively working through very similar debates of their own. It is worth noting that this progress was neither smooth nor universal. The 1980s saw the introduction of Section 28, a controversial law that banned local authorities and schools from what it termed the promotion of homosexuality, a policy that stayed on the books until its repeal in the early 2000s and left a lasting mark on an entire generation of LGBTQ students who grew up without open discussion or support in the classroom. The HIV and AIDS crisis of the same decade brought both devastating loss and eventually a wave of public health activism that reshaped attitudes towards sexual health, testing, and open dialogue between doctors and patients. More recently, transgender rights, non-binary identities, and questions around gender-affirming healthcare have become some of the most fiercely debated topics in modern British public life, showing that even in an era of broad tolerance, new frontiers of the same centuries-old conversation continue to emerge. So, where does Britain go from here? Experts and researchers point to several converging trends worth watching closely. Artificial intelligence and immersive digital technology are already beginning to reshape dating, companionship, and intimacy in ways that researchers are only just starting to properly understand, raising fresh and often uncomfortable questions about loneliness, genuine connection, and what relationships will even mean in an increasingly digital-first world. Ongoing, often heated debates around gender identity, reproductive rights, and online safety for young people strongly suggest that sexuality will remain a politically charged subject for many years to come, rather than settling into any kind of quiet national consensus. At the same time, falling marriage rates and steadily rising numbers of people choosing to remain single or deliberately child-free point toward a future where traditional family structures continue to diversify further rather than swinging back toward older, more rigid norms. Real challenges remain, including rising rates of sexually transmitted infections among young people, persistent disparities in how different communities and regions experience sexual freedom in practice, and growing concern among educators about the impact of algorithm-driven content on young people's understanding of relationships, consent, and body image. Yet there are genuine opportunities here too, as mental health awareness continues to grow alongside sexual health awareness, and as increasingly diverse voices gain real platforms to help shape future public policy. Most experts ultimately agree on one central point. Whatever direction Britain moves in next, it will almost certainly not be dictated from the top down by a single powerful institution, the way it largely once was, but will instead continue to be shaped by the same messy, bottom-up cultural pressure that has quietly driven every major shift in this story since 1707. Policymakers, religious leaders, and public health officials will all continue to have a seat at the table, but increasingly it is ordinary people, organizing online, sharing personal stories, and demanding accountability from institutions, who set the pace of change. If the last 300 years teach us anything, it is that predictions about the limits of acceptable change are almost always proven wrong within a generation or two. When you connect the dots across 3 full centuries, a strikingly clear pattern begins to emerge. Britain moved from a society where the state and the church tightly controlled personal sexuality through fear, shame, and harsh punishment, toward one where individual choice, scientific understanding, and open public debate now genuinely drive the conversation forward. The man executed in 1727 simply for who he loved, and to the couple who married in a joyful same-sex wedding in 2013, technically lived in the exact same country, separated by less than 300 years, yet in reality inhabited almost entirely different moral universes. What is truly surprising here is not that this change happened at all, but just how recently most of it actually occurred. Nearly every major legal transformation we've walked through today took place within living memory, well, within the lifetimes of people who are still alive right now, reading this very sentence. That means this particular story is far from finished, and its next chapter is being actively written at this very moment through the everyday choices an entirely new generation is making about identity, consent, and human connection. So here's the question genuinely worth sitting with for a moment. Do you think this transformation improved British society overall, or did it simply trade one set of problems for an entirely new set of challenges? Share your honest opinion in the comments below. If this journey through 3 centuries of British history surprised you, imagine how it must have felt to live through even one of these turning points without knowing how the story would end. Every generation in this story believed their own moment was the final word on morality, law, and love, and every single one of them was wrong. That, more than any single law or landmark event, might be the real lesson buried inside this history. A reminder that the conversation about sexuality, consent, and identity is never truly finished, only ever paused for a little while before the next generation picks it back up, asks its own uncomfortable questions, and pushes the story forward once again.